The other is just the personal enrichment that I've gotten out of the book myself. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say it's my favorite book, but it's my favorite book in terms of study and trying to figure things out and trying to, it just, when you study Revelation, it takes you into all of the Bible, so it really enriches your study. And then I think the final reason would be, or motive, would be, I'm convinced that Revelation is for today. And I don't think there's any other book in the New Testament that challenges us in the area of discipleship like this book. And so I've said that several times, that it is a discipleship manual. It's for Christians who are living in the pressure now. The dragon is real, the beast is real, the false prophet's real, the prostitute is real. These are the forces, the pressures that we're facing. And so it helps us to live in the now. And of course it gives us a picture of the future, and that's what our blessed hope is, the coming of Christ. So,
Great. Yeah, thank you. What does the book of Revelation add to the Gospels, to Acts, and to the other New Testament letters?
There is one sense in which it doesn't add anything. Everything that is in Revelation, in one sense, is in every other New Testament book. It's the last book. It's as though God has given us a way of looking at everything else that he said in a different way. But for example, the new heaven and the new earth, which we looked at this morning, Peter gives a long discourse in 2 Peter chapter 3 about the new heaven and the new earth. He calls it the home of righteousness. So that's all he says. He just says it's the home of righteousness. Whereas the King James puts it, I like it how it goes there, wherein dwelleth righteousness. I like that phrase. So Peter already tells us about the new heaven and the new earth. But Revelation comes at it from a different angle. And the death of Christ, the cross, I mean, it's in the gospel accounts. We have letters on that. But Revelation comes at the cross and just puts a different shade on it. So they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb. A lamb slaughtered at the center of the throne. So are there other verses that tell us that Jesus reigns from the cross? Yes, there are. But when you see the imagery of him standing at the very center of the throne, and he's the lamb who was slaughtered, it just makes those truths come alive in different ways. Let me just make reference to a couple of books. I'd like to mention some of these books tonight, but Eugene Peterson, who I've quoted from, I mentioned this book to you, Reverse Thunder, The Revelation of John and the Praying Imagination. He says something very similar to what I'm saying here, and it ties right in with the question you've asked. He writes, I do not read the Revelation to get additional information about the life of faith in Christ. I've read it all before in law and prophet, in gospel and epistle. Everything in Revelation can be found in the previous 65 books of the Bible. It's true. The Revelation adds nothing of substance to what we already know. The truth of the gospel is already complete, revealed in Jesus Christ. There is nothing new to say on the subject. But, he adds, there is a new way to say it. I read the Revelation not to get more information, but to revive my imagination. And that just punches it through. And that vision of the Lamb, the vision of Jesus, I mean the several visions of Jesus, just reveal something more about Jesus. It's already said, but it's said in a different way.
Yeah, great.
I got some other books here. Can I mention them?
Sure.
Yeah, one of the books that I found very, very helpful, actually really helpful, is The Complete Idiot's Guide to the Book of Revelation. And actually, it's a great book. There's good information at the little captions in that, and I'd like to give this as a gift to Bert.
You're obviously wanting me to pass it on to someone else. Looks good.
I think this is the best book I've ever read. The Incomparable Christ by John Stott. John Stott just went to be with the Lord, and I haven't read anything like it. And he breaks it down into 4 parts. He has the Jesus of church history, sorry, let me just go to the front. He has the original Jesus, the ecclesiastical Jesus, the influential Jesus, and the eternal Jesus. And chapter 4 is the eternal Jesus. And basically it's an exposition of the book of Revelation. And he just does a great job here.
I was on the platform once with John Stott.
Were you?
And I had one of those shirts on with a collar. He thought I was a bishop. So any time now.
Very good. Thanks, Bert. I feel good about that. This is, I think, if this isn't the best book that I've ever read, this is the best book on Revelation that you can get. It's called The Triumph of the Lamb by Dennis Johnson. There's a couple of people who have already picked a copy up. But if you want to know the theological background in which I'm coming to the book of Revelation from, this is it. This is an excellent book. Best thing ever written. I got some other ones here, but I'll refer to them later.
Okay, question number 4. Revelation 19:12 states, "He has a name written on him that no one knows but he himself." But in verse 11, he is called faithful and true. In verse 13, his name is the Word of God. Verse 16, King of kings and Lord of lords. John sees so much, yet cannot disclose the name. Why is this statement given to us?
Honestly, I don't really know the answer to that. But yeah, it is interesting that when in this vision of Jesus coming on the white horse, the conqueror, the captain of the armies of heaven, he's named 3 different times with 3 different names.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that John gives us those names, but then there's this line, he has a name written on him that no one but he himself knows.
Yeah.
And I think when I made reference to this when I was preaching on it, what I said there, and this was my best attempt really at trying to answer that, is every name of God, every name of Jesus in the Bible reveals something different about Jesus. So, I mean, how many names are there? You know, Emmanuel, the Lamb, the bright and morning star, the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. I mean, there's just all these names for the Lord Jesus Christ, and each one reveals something more about Jesus to us.
Yeah.
In this passage, he's faithful and true, and so on. So a name known only to him means, I think it means, that there is still more to Jesus that is going to be revealed to us. More about Jesus that we're going to discover, and we won't discover it until we're finally there in the new heaven and the new earth when Jesus reigns. And I'm assuming, now, the text doesn't say that name will be revealed to us, but I'm assuming it will. And so I don't know what else is going to be revealed to us about the Lord, but he's so great and so amazing that all the names we have can't capture who he really is.
Yeah. Names were important, weren't they? They were descriptors of the qualities of the individual.
Yeah. And a number of times in the Bible, you have people getting a name change, and that name change is important. Not that Jesus' name changes, but it does show us that there's a significance to the name that is given to a person. Yeah.
Okay. Where in the Bible does it say that the 144,000 represent the church?
Well, that's okay. Well, 144,000 are mentioned twice in Revelation. They're mentioned in chapter 7, and they're mentioned in chapter 14. Is there a verse that says the 144,000 is the church? No, there's not. But if we try to understand the nature of apocalyptic writing, how it's filled with symbols and images, and that the numbers have significance to them, then we have to stop and think through what that actually means. 144. If you remember, we didn't get into the text this morning, but we read in Revelation 21 that the walls of the city are 144 cubits thick. Okay? What's the significance of 144? And then it says that the measurements of the city, and if you measure the city, it's an actual cube. It's 12,000 stadia, and that works out to about 2,200 kilometers. Is John trying to tell us that the city is actually 22 kilometers high, wide, Whereas 12,000 stadia, just simply saying a very, very big place. It's long, it's huge, I think is what John is saying. So 12,000 is used there. 12 apostles of the Lamb, 12 gates to the city, 12 tribes, so 12, 12, 12. So 144,000 is 12 times 12.
Yeah.
Or 144 is 12 times 12. To the 10th power, to the 10th power. I mean, you keep adding it up, and all it's saying is a very, very large number. Mm-hmm. I think if you follow the structure, and I think structure is very important in Revelation. If you follow the structure of the text, it leads you to inevitable conclusions. So again, this pattern, John says, I heard, and then he says, I saw. Mm-hmm. So he hears in chapter 7 the number of those who were sealed, 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel. Now, just like he hears the Lion of the tribe of Judah, and he turns to see, and what does he see? A lamb. Mm-hmm. So what he sees is different from what he hears, but what he hears is what he sees, and what he sees is what he hears. So I heard the number. He turns, verse 9, after this I looked, there before me was a great multitude that no one could number. So again, I think the structure of the book, I think John is seeing exactly what he heard. So the 144,000 represents a complete number, a large number, a huge number. And verse 9 tells us that it's a great multitude that no one can number. Mm-hmm. The number of God's elect are known to God. They're not known to us. But I think it's a huge number. And I think that's what Revelation is telling us. I could go a little further. There's some other things in the text. I made reference to the fact that the tribes are actually listed there, 12,000 from each tribe, but the names of the tribes are actually changed in a couple of places. Interestingly, Judah is now put up at the top. Mm-hmm. And Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. And I think there are other verses. I think the fact that that's been changed shows that something has happened to Israel. Some change has occurred. And I think the other New Testament writings bear that out, that there are references in the other New Testament writings and in Revelation where descriptives that were given to Israel in the Old Testament are now given to God's people, the New Testament. So, for example, Revelation 1:6, and has made us to be a kingdom and priests to serve his God and Father. I mean, that's a letter to the 7 churches. Yeah. And he's saying that they're a kingdom of priests. But that's the same terminology that was used of Old Testament. Sure. Is Israel. 1 Peter 2:9, you are a holy people, a chosen nation. And Peter's writing to believers, mm-hmm. Jew and Gentile. The same words or names are given to them. So that's one reason why I believe the 144,000 is a reference to God's people. Mm-hmm. It's a number that signifies a beautiful thing.
Okay, great. What is your view, here we go, on the rapture of the church? Since the church has been mentioned 18 times in the first 3 chapters, and then not referred to in the rest of the book, I think we're right. Could it be that the Apostle John saw the rapture of the church at the beginning of chapter 4?
Okay. Actually, there's a misnomer in the way the question's posed. The word church is actually used more than just in chapter 2 and chapter 3. It's actually used at the end of the book. Yeah. In chapter 22, verse 16, I, Jesus, have sent my angel to give you this testimony for the churches. So, this is a letter for churches. I think that's key. Now, the theology that believes that the rapture of the church occurs in Revelation chapter 4, there is no explicit reference to the rapture in the book of Revelation. It's just not there. Now, there is a rapture, and I can talk about that in a moment, but there's an assumption that when John sees his vision of the throne, John gets caught up. It says that he's caught up into heaven and he sees all this. Yeah. So there's kind of a spiritualizing that takes place and says, oh, well, that, John is sort of symbolic of the whole church. And he got caught up, so the whole church gets caught up. And so from chapter 4 to chapter 19, 20, there's no references to the church. And it's true, the word church is not used from chapter 4 to chapter 19. And so the assumption is that means the church is taken out and that everything that happens from chapter 4 to chapter 20 has no reference to the church at all. It's people who live during the tribulation period, this 7-year period of time. And the difficulty I have with that is that means then that a large part of the book of Revelation is not for us. It's reference to saints who live in the future after we're taken away. And if that's the case, then a large portion of the book becomes somewhat irrelevant to us, except for intellectual curiosity as to what takes place during that 7-year period. But it really doesn't affect us in terms of the here and now. The other thing is, there are references to followers of the Lamb, to the redeemed, to the saints, to the 144,000. These are other terms that are used from chapter 4 to chapter 19. But those are the same terms that are used in the other New Testament books to refer to us, the church. So just because the word church isn't there, that doesn't mean that the church isn't there.
Okay.
So where in the Bible do we have a differentiation between this kind of saint and that kind of saint? We're saints. Paul to the church at Philippi, to the saints, to the elders and deacons and the saints, he says right at the beginning of his book. So if we have different kinds of saints who live in different kinds of eras and ages, then I think it really confuses it. So I don't think that that's an accurate statement at all. Let me just add another thing from a historical perspective on this. One of the things that really jarred my thinking on Revelation in my early Christian days was when I began to study the history of the church and to understand how other Christian leaders in the past read the book and what it meant to them. For example, Martin Luther, while he struggled with Revelation, he even wondered at times whether it ought to be in the Bible, he drew more comfort from the book of Revelation than any other book apart from the Psalms, because he believed he was in it. And that was true of all of the Protestant reformers. They saw themselves living in the reality of what Revelation 4 through 19 is all about. And so when you begin to see that saints in the past have had a perspective on Revelation that we perhaps don't have so much today, it makes you really think your theology through. Because these are certainly not people who were unenlightened. They had the Spirit just as we have the Spirit. This teaching is what we call dispensationalism. It's probably the most dominant kind of teaching that most of us have had before. And dispensationalism is premillennial, but it's a certain kind of premillennialism. And it makes a very strong distinction between Israel and the church. In essence, I believe that dispensationalism teaches that there are two peoples of God. There is Israel, the Jews, and there is the church. And so the teaching is that God, with the coming of Christ, when Jesus was rejected by the Jews in his first coming, he offered the kingdom legitimately to them. They rejected it. You remember Jesus said he would give the kingdom to another group of people. And as you read the Acts through, Paul shakes the dust off his feet when the Jews reject the gospel, and he goes to the Gentiles. So the teaching is that God's plan is ultimately Israel, the nation. But because Israel rejected its Messiah, God went into plan B. And there's this parenthesis age in which we live today. And that's God's plan B, which is the church. But then the church gets taken away at the rapture. And then God works on Israel again. And God goes back to his original intention of restoring her. It's based on a couple of verses in Daniel. But if you have that kind of an understanding of a complete distinction between Israel and the church, then you can very easily come to that kind of theological thinking about Revelation, and about the rapture, and about the tribulation period. But if you see that there is one people of God, only one, yes, in the Old Testament manifested in a nation, but in the New Testament fulfilled in a broader nation, not just the Jews, but Gentiles are added. Ephesians 2 talks about God breaking down the dividing wall of hostility, that we were foreigners and aliens to the covenant, but now God has brought us in, and we're made one with God's people, meaning is Israel. So the church doesn't replace Israel. The church fulfills Israel. The church becomes everything that Israel was intended to be. So, I mean, I could go on, because there are all kinds of verses in Galatians. Paul talks very clearly about the children of Abraham are those who have faith in Jesus. And then in Romans 2, Paul talks about a Jew is not one who is a Jew outwardly, but a Jew inwardly. So there are all these verses that
the heroes of the faith in Hebrews.
Yes, it's there in Hebrews 2. Example, in Hebrews, it quotes from Jeremiah 31 that God made a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Jacob. So Jeremiah 31, God makes the new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Jacob. Question, are we the new covenant people of God or not? You see, if the new covenant is only for the house of Israel and the house of Jacob, then that means that only the Jews are included in the new covenant blessings. But Jesus, when he shed Jesus at the Passover said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." Now granted, the 12 men who sat around the table were all Jews. But we read later on in Acts that they celebrated the Lord's table in the churches. Paul wrote about the Lord's table in Corinthians, which was a church made up primarily of Gentiles. So the new covenant meal was enjoyed by Gentiles. So who is the house of Israel and the house of Jacob? It's the church. It's all of us. Again, that ties back in with the 144,000 thing. So there is a distinction between Israel and the church, because Israel is the Old Testament version of what God was doing. The church is the New Testament version of the people of God. There is a distinction. One was a national identity, an ethnic people. The church is a multitude which no man can number, from every nation, every tribe. It's a multi-ethnic people. But they're one people. One people. That's key. That's key. The moment we get into two peoples, I think we end up with real theological trouble. Another thing I want to say is this. I'm going on a bit too long on this one question. But I think it ties in probably with some of the other questions we have here. This teaching is relatively new in the history of the church. It finds its origins around 1840, 1850, and became very popular in the United States. And in the early 1900s, during the whole fundamentalist modernist controversy, this teaching kind of grew. It became an ascendant teaching. Right here, very close to us, they had the Niagara Bible Conference in the early 1900s, and that was down in Niagara on the Lake. People came from all over North America to attend conferences there, and that's where that teaching really began to take off, and it got rooted in the churches. But you don't have you can look through the history of the church. You have premillennialism in the early days, right through the church, but you don't have this dispensationalism, which makes a clear distinction between Israel and the church. That is a very, very recent teaching in the history of the church. But it is a very popular one, and it's sort of the prominent thing within many evangelical schools today. But more and more, I'm finding there are very few pastors that I know of who really hold to that. I mean, there are many who do, but more and more, I'm seeing this even with the younger men who are coming out of our schools today. They're not buying it. So I don't believe there's that kind of a distinction. There's one people of God. So the church is there. The church is there in Revelation. If the church isn't there, then everything I've been preaching for the last 3-4 months Doesn't make any sense. If it doesn't relate to us, then I've been wasting my time, really. I have been. Hope I haven't been.
Okay, you've
Sorry, I went on
you
a bit.
answered question 6, and I think you answered question 7 at the same time.
Okay.
So we'll skip to number 8. You said that we are now living in the tribulation. If that is true, when would you say the tribulation started, and how far are we along? I was always of the belief that the man of lawlessness would make a peace treaty with the nation of Israel and other nations before the tribulation starts, as alluded to in Daniel 9:27. Can you explain?
Daniel 9:27 is a tough verse. So I'm not gonna. I'd like to avoid Daniel 9:27. I won't, but let me try to answer the question without dealing with Daniel 9, and maybe we could talk about Daniel 9 in a different way. There are 3 times in the Bible, in the New Testament, where the phrase "Great Tribulation" is found. Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Revelation chapter 7, I think it is. Chapter 7, verse 14. Yes, these are they who have come out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. And then in Matthew 24, Jesus, the New International Version actually calls it distress. Distress, tribulation could be the same thing. I don't have the actual reference in Matthew 24, but I can find that pretty fast. Matthew 24. I won't turn to Luke 21, but the phrase is found there as well. But Matthew 24 perhaps is better known to us than Luke 21. Maybe someone can help me here. Great distress. 21. Yeah, for then shall be great distress or great tribulation, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Now, if you go back to verse 15, he talks about the abomination of desolation through the prophet Daniel. Verse 16, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of his house. Let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, great tribulation, unequal from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. Anyway, it goes on and mentions a number of other things. Let's deal with Revelation 7 first. John has this vision of the great multitude, which no one can number, and these are the individuals who he says have come out of the great tribulation. Great is just a kind of an adjective that's added on the front of the word. It just means it's a tribulation that's really bad. John, at the beginning of Revelation, says that he is our fellow companion in the tribulation that is ours in Jesus. Mm-hmm. So John says tribulation is ours in Jesus. It's something that we experience. So I think Revelation is describing the whole of the church, not just the church at one particular period of time or a group of people who aren't the church later in the future. These are they who've come out of great tribulation. It's God's people. They're in it. They're in it. And if you go to Revelation chapter 2, there's reference made to one of the churches being in tribulation. I forget which one it was now. But several of them were suffering. So the letter is written to churches that are in tribulation. Mm-hmm. That's the whole thing. And so the vision is to encourage these churches, these believers who are in it. They're experiencing it. Now, going to Matthew 24, Matthew 24 is a very, very difficult passage. And the reason why it's difficult is because Jesus is speaking not just about the end of the world and the second coming. He's also speaking about the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. And the reference, I believe the reference in verse 21, then will be great distress, is a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
The verses that precede it are specific words that are told that flee to the mountains, don't go into the city. Do you know what actually happened? Interestingly, the Jews fled into Jerusalem when 70 AD happened. And what Jesus prophesied here actually happened. The city was destroyed. There were, I think the estimation is about 2 million Jews who fled into the city. You know how many actually came out alive? 93,000. I mean, it was a first century Holocaust. They were butchered in the city. It was a terrible time. Josephus, the historian, writes about what actually happened. That's what Jesus is prophesying here. So the great distress that he's talking about in Matthew 24 is something that happened historically in 70 AD. Now, in saying that, however, in Matthew 24, Jesus, I don't know how else to put it, he speaks in a strange way, because the question he's answering at the beginning of the passage, go to Matthew 24:1. Jesus left the temple, was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things, he asked? I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another until everyone will be thrown down. That's the destruction of Jerusalem. The temple was destroyed. The only thing left is the Wailing Wall today, which was sort of underground at that point in time. It's the only thing that's left. You can see it in Israel today. I mean, the thing was completely wiped out. He said everything will be thrown down. Verse 3, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? When will what happen? When will the thrones be stoned, the stones be thrown down? When will the temple be destroyed? And then they ask, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, it's very possible that the disciples, when they asked the question, they would have viewed the destruction of the temple as the end of the age. I mean, as Jews, they would have thought, that's it. If the temple's destroyed, we're done. It's the end of the world. So that might have been where they were coming from. But clearly the question is nuanced. When will this happen, and what will be the sign? So I think what Jesus does in Matthew 24 is he answers both questions, destruction of Jerusalem and the end of the world, and he interweaves his answer. So it's difficult to discern when is he talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and when is he talking about the second coming. But they're all woven in. And that's what makes Matthew 24 a difficult passage. But I think the reference here in Matthew 24 is really a reference to 70 AD. However, there are things in Matthew 24, like verse 15, when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Now that's a puzzling verse, because the reference to the abomination of desolation is found 2 times in Daniel 11:21 or 12, and Daniel 13:11. Clearly, Daniel's prophecy was fulfilled in 170 BC. In 170 BC, and I think that's brought out when you look at Daniel 13:11, it talks about the abomination of desolation, and it mentions the 1,260 days. And in 170 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes, the Greek Seleucid ruler, entered Jerusalem with his armies. They slaughtered a pig on the altar of the Holy of Holies. And that started the Maccabean revolt. And that revolt went on for 1,260 days, 3.5 years. Judas Maccabeus, which really means Judas the Hammer, he was the guerrilla leader of that. And they actually managed to defeat the Seleucids. So Daniel is making reference to something that was fulfilled in 170 years before Jesus came. That was the abomination of desolation. But Jesus, look what he says here. When you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, Jesus is speaking about this as though it's a future event. Interesting. Then he says, let the reader understand. Understand what? I think what he's saying is, let the reader understand this, that the abomination of desolation is something that's going to happen again. That's what he's saying. So when Antiochus Epiphanes came into the temple and slaughtered that pig on the altar, that was the abomination of desolation. And the Jews went ballistic at that point in time. 3.5 years of intense fighting, they finally won. Jesus says, let the reader understand. And he speaks of Daniel's prophecy as being future from his time. Mm-hmm. But it was fulfilled 170 years before him. So when was it fulfilled a second time? 70 A.D. Because Titus did the same thing. Yeah. When the Roman legions came into Jerusalem, they did the same thing, went into the temple, and they sacrificed a pig on the altar. I mean, so there is this multiple fulfillment of prophecy. Now, I think that the fulfillment of Matthew 24, verse 15, finds its primary fulfillment when Titus came into the city at 70 A.D. But I think there's another fulfillment of it. And it's interesting. In prophecy, you have these mountain peaks. For example, when you read in Isaiah, you'll read about the coming of Jesus in Isaiah, and there are verses. Isaiah's, he's seeing the coming of Jesus way off in the future. And you've all had this experience. You're driving in a car, you're coming up to the mountains. I remember the first time Andrea and I got in a car and drove from Calgary to Banff, and you come upon the Rockies, and when you're way back, it looks like just one great big mountain. But as you get closer, you pass the first one. But before you got there, it looked like it was one mountain, but when you get up closer, you realize there's another one behind it. And I think that's what you have happening in prophecy, because there are some times where a prophecy is given about Jesus, and it's definitely clearly his first coming. Mm-hmm. But the next sentence is a phrase that's in reference to his second coming. So when Isaiah saw it, it looked like one thing to him. I think that's why the Jews missed it, because they confused the first and the second coming. But when you get past the first mountain, it's behind you, then you can see that the second line is the second mountain. And so, in a sense, there's this mountain peak thing that happens in prophecy, and sometimes a multiple fulfillment of things that take place. So, is there a future abomination of desolation? And I think there is. And I think that's what Paul talks about in 2 Thessalonians. If you want to just turn there for a moment. I'm really jumping away from I'm kind of answering the question, I think. I talked about this last Sunday morning. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered to him, we ask you, brothers, not to become easily unsettled or alarmed by some prophecy, report, or letter supposed to have come from us, saying that the day of the Lord has already come. So they thought that Jesus had already shown up, and they missed it. Well, they were wrong, of course. So Paul's trying to help them now. So he says, well, don't let anyone deceive you, verse 3, in any way. For that day will not come until the rebellion occurs, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. Verse 4, he opposes and exalts himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, and even sets himself up in where? God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. Interesting. Now, the term abomination of desolation isn't used there, but this is an abomination of desolation event. Any man who goes into God's temple and proclaims that he is God, apart from Jesus, that's an abomination of desolation. So I see the man of lawlessness as some future ruler, political, religious, who knows, but somehow he is going to proclaim himself to be God. He's going to, just like Satan, just like Lucifer, I will ascend to the high, the Most High. And that is an abomination of desolation event. So I see Matthew 24 primarily being fulfilled in 70 AD, but I think there's also a future fulfillment to it here in 2 Thessalonians 2. Mm-hmm. And I forgot what the original question was now. Sorry.
Fortunately, I have it printed out here.
Okay.
You know what? It's 5 to 7.
Oh boy.
We've got about 20 minutes because Jan's getting picked up at 7:15. So we got to move it here.
Okay. Sorry.
What do you believe about replacement theology?
I think I touched on that already. Replacement theology is a relatively new term that is used. You'll hear popular television preachers like John Hagee use this term, and what he's saying is replacement. Normally the term is, this is a strong word, but it's normally used in a derogatory sense. If you believe that the church is Israel, then you have replacement theology. The church replaces Israel. I don't like the term because I think it's a misnomer. I think it impugns a certain type of theology to my own personal position, which I don't believe. Again, the church does not replace Israel. The church fulfills Israel. I believe there's a big difference to that.
Yeah. And really, I think you've answered number 12. Where does Israel or the Jewish people fit into God's plan of prophecy? Is there any hope for Israel as a people, as a nation? Yeah. Does national Israel have a special destiny? Does the modern state of Israel represent a fulfillment of prophecy?
Yeah,
you've touched on that a little bit.
Yeah, can I touch on a little bit more?
Touch away.
Okay. I think Romans 11 gives us the best answer to that. If you want to turn to Romans 11, this might take the next 20 minutes, I don't know. But in Romans 9 through 11, Paul expresses great concern for his own people. Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. That was his primary mission and calling. But very clearly, Paul's strategy and mission was he always went to the Jews first. You see that when he moves throughout the Greek-Roman world. And in Romans chapter 1, he says to the Jew first and also to the Greek. So he recognized that because Israel as a people had received the promises and the prophecies that they were special and that God had set them apart, and so he always took the gospel to them first. So in chapter 9, chapter 10, he expresses this burden for his own people. But then, of course, he's faced with the reality that, by and large, Israel as a nation rejected its Messiah. And we know that the first believers were Jewish, the apostles were Jewish, but it wasn't long before the church began to lose its Jewishness, and it became a great multitude of people from every nation. The Gentiles were added to the church. Mm-hmm. So Paul poses this question: does this mean that God has rejected Israel as a people? And right at the beginning of chapter 11, he says, I asked then, did God reject his people? By no means. I am an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. So he goes on, he says, no. This is not a complete, ultimate, total rejection of Israel. He makes that very clear. However, in verse 5, he says, so too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. In the preceding verses, he makes reference to Elijah. Remember, Elijah thought he was the only one, the only righteous one, and God reminded him, no, there was a remnant. There were 3,000 who had not bowed the knee to Baal. Yeah. And so Paul says, it's the same now. There's still a remnant. A small group of Jews right now do believe. They're chosen by grace. So, no, God has not completely abandoned the Jewish people, I believe is what he's saying. Go down to verse 11. This is a very cursory kind of touching on this. Again, I ask, did they stumble so far as to fall beyond recovery? Was their rejection of Jesus ultimate? And then Paul's saying, no, not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. So all the Gentile peoples of the world coming into the church, now being related to Messiah, now becoming the children of Abraham through faith, Paul says he's hoping that it's going to make the Jewish people envious of what they're receiving. Heard an interesting stat. This is from the Missionary Research Institute. 77,000 people come to Christ every day around the world.
Yeah.
77,000. 90% of those are in the global south. South America, Africa, Asia. Mm-hmm. I mean, so it's phenomenal. I mean, it's Pentecost how many times over? Mm-hmm. The majority of those are not Jews. They're Gentiles. And I think what Paul's saying is this is going to make the Jews envious. That's what he's hoping for. So he has some great hope. I'm going to have to skip over a pile of things here. But basically what he says in these verses is he describes the Jews as this olive tree. A cultivated olive tree is the term he uses. And he says then that the Gentiles, you and I, most of us, there perhaps are a few Jews among us, the Gentiles are grafted in. We're the wild shoot, a wild branch. Still an olive tree, but a wild branch, and we get grafted in to the original olive tree. Okay? And the point Paul makes is we shouldn't boast because we're not the natural branches. And just as he cut off the natural branches, well, he could cut off the grafted branches too if God wanted to. Mm-hmm. So, really, I'm really moving fast here. But here's one thing I want to say, though. It's only one tree. It's not two trees. Again, there's this distinction thing. I got to hammer away on this. There are not two peoples of God, the church and Israel. There's one people of God. It's one tree, but the Gentiles are grafted into that tree. And if you read the passage through, you will discover that at a certain point, Paul gives this hope that at some point in time, the Jews, the natural branch which was cut off, is going to be grafted back in again. Mm-hmm. And verse 23, if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. After all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature, were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more easily or readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? Yeah, it's a great truth. So, verse 25. I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced hardening in part. They're hardened to the gospel until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. Now, I believe what Paul is saying here is that at some point, we don't know when, but at some point in time, presumably just before Jesus comes, the full number of Gentiles who are going to be saved, grafted into this tree, will be saved. And at that point, when that happens, then God will bring this wild olive branch back and graft it in. So the next verse is an incredible one. And so all Israel will be saved. And so I think he's holding out a hope that God is going to do a great thing among the Jewish people. But he is not going to make them a people distinct from the church. He's going to bring them into the church.
Graft them back in.
Graft them in, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, you talked about when Jesus would come. Mm-hmm. This question says, Jesus said no one knows the day or hour when he will return, but is there some way we can know when it is close? Is there some sign that would indicate it is near?
Well, yeah, and that would bear out thinking that would say there's a complete distinction between the Jew and the church. Personally, I don't think that's what's being said. I think Matthew is a gospel written for all of God's people. Now, okay, well, thank you, Dennis, but I don't make that distinction between the wife of Jehovah and the bride of Christ, primarily because I think Jesus is Jehovah God. and he has one bride. And I think that when you, for example, where I preached this morning in Revelation 21, I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, presented as a bride, he says, as a bride. So the city is a bride. So I understand where you're coming from, but it's the bride, it's the city. How does he then go on to describe this bride, the city? 12 apostles of the Lamb, 12 tribes of Israel, 12 gates. So the whole thing of 12 comes out again, and so I think John is describing one people. But
Okay.
thanks for your comment. But
I think maybe the two of you could have that conversation, and we'll move on.
okay. So you wanted to talk about no one will know the time?
Yeah.
Again, I think I would direct your attention to Matthew 24, which we're just talking about now. Jesus says some interesting things in Matthew 24. I think he gives us what we could call general signs. General signs. And now, the general signs don't tell us that it's near, however. I think Jesus makes that clear. I think when Jesus talks about these general signs, it's just he's saying, this is what will characterize this age in which we live. So in Matthew 24, you've got verse 5, many will come in my name claiming I'm Christ. So there's going to be religious deception that happens during this age. Verse 7, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, earthquakes in various places, natural disasters, political upheaval is what he's talking about. Luke 21 uses the word pestilences, which is an interesting word. So bad things are going to happen. Verse 8 is the key. All these are the beginnings of birth pains. So my understanding of what Jesus is saying here is that there's going to be all these natural disasters, there's going to be wars, political upheaval, there's going to be spiritual deception and declension that characterizes this age. These are the beginning of birth pains. But what happens with birth pains? As delivery arrives, or just about arrives, the birth pains become more frequent and more intense. More frequent and more intense. So generally, I would say, we can look out at the world and see this type of stuff. These things have always happened in the history of the world. Always been earthquakes, always been pestilences, always been nations and kingdoms rising up and political upheaval. But it's going to get more intense and more frequent as we get closer to the coming of Jesus. I think that's what he's saying. So that's a general sign. A specific sign would be verse 14. This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So I think that keeping our eyes and our fingers on the pulse of world missions and what's happening around the world, as we see the gospel going to the whole world, I think that's a sign that the end is near. That God wants to reach all of the nations. And there's never been a time in the history of the church where we're at right now. The gospel's spreading. Even in places where we think it's very, very closed, there's incredible things that are taking place. Yeah. So we are living in an incredible time of harvest, and so I think we're getting closer. The final thing I would say, two other things, sorry. I'd go back to 2 Thessalonians 2. I think the revelation of the man of lawlessness is a sign. He says that right there in 2 Thessalonians 2. The end hasn't come yet. Do you know why? Because the man of lawlessness has to be revealed first. Now, I'm going to go back to the tribulation issue. 2 Thessalonians is written to a church. He tells the church, you're not going to know when it's going to happen until the man of lawlessness is revealed. Why is he telling them that? Because the church is going to experience it. Yeah. The church is going to experience it. We're not taken away. We're going to be there. The man of lawlessness will be revealed. So he gives that information to the church because the church is going to be there when it happens. Well, okay, Dennis, we're trying to get through a number of questions. So I'd be happy to dialogue afterwards, but we kind of decided we wouldn't take questions from the floor tonight just because we had so many here, and even then we're not able to do justice to what we've got here. So that's a sign. And then in Matthew 24, Jesus says, the sign of the Son of Man will appear. He will be seen in the clouds. Yep. Now, at that point, I mean, it's almost over. The moment he shows up, it's a sign. But so we can't know the day or the hour. It is going to be sudden. Jesus talked about his coming like a thief. He'll come like a thief in the night. And that terminology is found in Revelation as well. Yeah.
Here's a good question for you. If there is there an official Baptist position on the second coming and the millennium? Charles Spurgeon is the most famous of Baptist preachers. What did he believe about the millennium?
Spurgeon, it's interesting. When you read Spurgeon, it's hard to pin him down. Peter Masters, who's the pastor of the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London, which was Spurgeon's church, is emphatic that Spurgeon was an amillennialist. Earl Hulse, who is a Baptist historian in England, says that Charles Spurgeon was a postmillennialist. And there are statements that Spurgeon himself made that are very premillennial. So nobody can pin Spurgeon down.
He's a true Baptist.
He probably is. Yeah. There is a document that Charles Spurgeon signed, a statement of faith that has a premillennial clause in it. So I think that Spurgeon was a premillennialist, but his focus was so much on the gospel, it really didn't matter to him. His attitude, I mean, he was a premillennialist who thought like an amillennialist who had a postmillennialist heart. And he wanted to see people come to Christ, and that was the main focus of his ministry. So there is no official Baptist position. Baptists have held all kinds of positions. So, yeah. Spurgeon was a great man. Great mind.
Yeah.
And he didn't think it was that important. And ultimately it isn't. Because the millennium isn't our hope. Regardless of what we believe about the millennium, regardless of how you look at it, nowhere in the Bible are we told that that's our hope. 2 Peter says we look for a new heaven and a new earth, the home of righteousness. That's where our hope is.
Yeah.
That's where our hope is.
Here's a whole different way of looking at what you've been speaking on. In regards to created things, such as the sun and moon, what will this look like in the new heavens and the new earth? For example, God's glory will be light. The sun and the moon will have no purpose. However, when God created those things, he called them good. Will they still exist? Or will they be nothing compared to the light of God's glory? And with the moon, will there be no night or sleep, even though our bodies depend on sleep now?
That's an interesting question. Starting from the rear end of the question, will we need sleep? We know that Jesus ate in his resurrected body. So his body functioned just like our bodies do in terms of eating. Whether he needed food, however, to sustain his physical life in a resurrection body, I don't know. I doubt that. However, God made food, and he said it was good. The fruit, he said it was good. So if it's a restoration of Eden, eating is one of the things we enjoy so much in life. It's hard to believe that we're not going to eat in heaven. And Revelation 19 speaks of the marriage supper of the Lamb. So I would say we're going to eat. So will we sleep? I don't know. Do we need to sleep? Probably not. I really don't know the answer to that. All I know is that the resurrection body doesn't wear out. It would be nice, though, to walk around for 100 years and not take a nap. Imagine all the work you could get done if you didn't have to sleep. But the reference is made to the sun or the moon. It's the eternal city, and the Lamb is the lamp of the city. The glory of God gives it light. This is a reference to Revelation 21, verse 23, in case you're wondering where the question is coming from. The verse says, "The city does not need the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and the Lamb is its lamp." So I think the question is really saying, is there going to be a sun and a moon in the new creation? And the text doesn't say there won't be. The text just says the city does not need the sun or the moon. I think it's the new heavens, plural, and the new earth. The heavens declare the glory of God. The Jews in the ancient world looked at first heaven, second heaven, third heaven. We use different terms today, but so I think there's going to be a universe. I think there's going to be stars. I think there'll be planets. I think there'll be an atmosphere. There'll be birds in the heavens. I think it's the restoration of Eden. So I would say the sun and the moon will be there, but they won't be needed like they're needed now.
Mm-hmm. Letourneau used to say that God was going to give him a job of creating new universes.
Well, next Sunday morning when I get into this a little bit more, what the new heaven and new earth is full of, there's an earthiness to what is coming. I think many Christians, we got this idea that our eternal state is sort of this cloud-like spirit disembodied existence. Nothing could be further from the truth. I think it's the world restored. It's very earthy.
Yeah.
Physical resurrection bodies. I think will be recognizable. Some of us may want to change our looks. Maybe the Lord will be gracious in the resurrection body, but
well, some more than others.
Yeah, I actually had a conversation with someone today, and you know the imagery in Isaiah, the lamb lying down with the wolf and so on. Is that just imagery to say there won't be violence in the world, or is there going to be animal life there? Mm-hmm. I think there's going to be animal life, but the natural animal world will not be violent like it is now. I mean, think of all the animals that have become extinct over the years. Dinosaurs.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, it'd be awesome to see a Tyrannosaurus Rex. No, really, it would be. As long as it's not violent, you know.
Yeah.
And to go up and pet a lion and to play around with a rhinoceros. No, really, I'm being serious. I think it's creation restored. I think it's going to be absolutely amazing. It's earthy.
Yeah.
It's very earthy.
Yeah. Well, that's next Sunday.
Next Sunday.
Okay, yep. And Jan's ride is waiting for her.
Yeah, her time is gone.
And you've made reference to the moon, and it's going to be coming up soon. And I need my sleep.
Okay. Can I just make reference to a couple of other books then?
Okay.
I assume we're closing.
Yeah.
Right. Here's an excellent book called Breaking the Code by Bruce Metzger. I'm going to leave these up in the front if you want to have a peek at this. It's Understanding the Book of Revelation is the subtitle. Very thin book, easy to read, very helpful. This is a commentary that has helped me the most. I Saw Heaven Opened, the message of Revelation. This is in the Bible Speaks Today series that John Stott is the editor of. And I think of all the books I've read on Revelation, this one probably has helped me the most. And one of the best commentaries on Revelation that you can find anywhere is this one here. The author is G.K. Beale. It's very thick. This is just a treasure trove. If you want to dive into Revelation and dig up some more stuff, this is an excellent book. And the last one I want to make reference to is 40 Questions About the End Times. And this is a book I'm going to be donating to the library. And some of the questions that we didn't get to tonight are actually in the book. This is a premillennial understanding of the millennium. But it's a great book from beginning to end. And so I hope people can pick it up and read it.
Okay, you didn't make mention.
One other thing. A number of years ago, I wrote a little book, and we actually sold them here. We had leftover copies from my former church called The End of the World. It's just a 4-volume, 4-chapter book, 4 sermons that I preached on the end of the world. And so we reprinted the book, and it's actually available in the foyer. And we're selling them for $10. We don't really make any money on that. But if you want to buy them, it will answer some of the questions. It deals partially with Revelation, but it focuses more on what the Scripture says about the end of the world. So that's available out in the foyer.
And you didn't make mention of the book that I loaned you. I'm hoping to see it back someday.
Yeah, I forget which one that was.
Yeah.
I'll give you the Idiot's Guide for their book. How's that?
Put it on the front pew. Maybe somebody will pick it up.
Okay.
Okay, thanks again for coming. We appreciate your attention, and thank you, Pastor John, for you really put yourself on the line here, and we appreciate it.
Great.
And
Thank you.
again, we are blessed to have you with us, and the kind of opening of the Word that you've been doing, not only in Revelation, but in John and all the others. So thanks again.
Amen.